Look at her eyes. Those bright, innocent eyes full of wonder. That smile that could light up any room. That's Rica Rountree at age 8, holding her favorite doll, living in a world where imagination was her escape. But behind those eyes lay a story that would shake an entire community to its core. A story that forces us to question everything we know about protecting our most vulnerable. Every child deserves to feel safe. Every child deserves to be heard. But what happens when the very systems designed to protect them fail? What happens when the warning signs are there, clear as day, but no one takes action? This isn't just another tragic headline. This is the story of Rica Rountree, a precious 8-year-old girl whose life was cut devastatingly short. It's a story about systemic failure, about missed opportunities, and about voices that went unheard until it was too late. Before we continue with Rica's story, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here. Your presence matters because these stories need to be told, these lessons need to be learned. If you're new to True Crime Watch HD, consider joining our community by hitting that subscribe button. Together, we can ensure these stories aren't forgotten, and perhaps prevent them from happening again. Rica's story begins like many others, with a mother doing her best to provide for her children. Antonita Simmons, or Ann as everyone called her, was Rica's world. They were inseparable, two souls connected by an unbreakable bond. And described Rica as her shadow, always following close behind, always ready with a smile or a song. She wasn't just my daughter, and would later say, her voice breaking with emotion. She was my best friend. Every day with her was a new adventure. In their small home, Rica created magical worlds with her dolls. These weren't just toys to her, they were her children, her responsibility. She would dress them, feed them, and tuck them in at night with the same care and attention a mother would give her child. It was more than play. It was Rica's way of expressing the love and security she felt in her own life. But in 2016, that security began to crumble. The weight of financial hardship pressed down on Ann, a single mother struggling to keep her family afloat. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. I want you to think about this for a moment. How many Rica Rountrees are out there right now? How many children are silently crying out for help while we go about our daily lives? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might help someone recognize the warning signs before it's too late. The year 2016 marked a turning point in Rica's life. And, desperate to provide for her children, made a decision that would haunt her forever. Faced with mounting bills and the threat of homelessness, she turned to selling drugs. It wasn't greed that drove her, it was survival. But the law doesn't see desperation, it sees crime. In September of that year, Ann was arrested. In an instant, Rica's world shattered. The system, operating on protocol rather than intuition, made a decision that would prove fatal. They placed Rica in the custody of her biological father, Richard Rountree. Ann's pleas echoed through the corridors of power, but no one seemed to listen. "I begged them not to send her there," she would later recall, her voice heavy with the weight of knowledge that came too late. "I knew something wasn't right. I told them she wouldn't be safe." But there was something the authorities either didn't know or chose to ignore. Richard Rountree's girlfriend, Cynthia Baker, had a history, a dark history that should have raised every red flag in the system. Previous allegations of child abuse, including an attempt to drown a stepchild, lay buried in files that no one seemed to read. The transition to Richard Rountree's home happened quickly, too quickly for anyone to properly assess the environment Rica was entering. While the system saw a father taking custody of his daughter, they failed to see the darkness that awaited her behind closed doors. This wasn't just a new home, it was the beginning of Rica's nightmare. From the moment Rica crossed the threshold, Cynthia Baker made it clear that this child was unwanted. The transformation was immediate and cruel. Gone were the days of playing with dolls, of creating magical worlds where everything was safe and beautiful. Instead, Rica entered a realm where childhood itself became a luxury she could no longer afford. The first changes were subtle, the kind that might not raise immediate alarms to outsiders. Rica's bright clothes were replaced with worn-out hand-me-downs. Her once neat appearance became disheveled. The sparkle in her eyes, that infectious joy that had defined her, began to dim. But these were just the visible signs of a much deeper trauma unfolding within those walls. Cynthia Baker's regime of torture was methodical and calculated. She didn't just want to hurt Rica, she wanted to break her spirit entirely. The punishments she devised went beyond conventional abuse. They were exercises in humiliation and endurance that would challenge even an adult's strength, let alone that of an 8-year-old child. One of Baker's favorite torments was what investigators would later call the can punishment. Rica would be forced to stand, her small arms extended, holding heavy cans of food. Not for minutes, not even for an hour, but for hours on end. When her arms would begin to shake, when her muscles would scream in agony and her body would start to give out, Baker would be there, ready to deliver brutal consequences for this perceived weakness. While other children in the house sat down to meals together, Rica ate alone, if she was allowed to eat at all. Her food was rationed, controlled, turned into yet another tool of torment. The family would gather at the dinner table, sharing meals and conversation, while Rica sat isolated, watching others enjoy what she was denied. This wasn't just physical deprivation, it was emotional torture of the cruelest kind. Sleep, that basic human need, became another battlefield. While other children in the house had proper beds, Rica was forced to sleep on a bare mattress on the floor. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about dignity. Every night, as she lay there alone, she was reminded of her status in this household, less than, unwanted, unworthy. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Rica's new life was the destruction of her dolls. These weren't just toys, they were her companions, her comfort, her last connection to the happy life she once knew with her mother. Cynthia Baker understood this, which is precisely why she targeted them. One by one, Rica's precious dolls were destroyed, each one a deliberate act of emotional violence designed to strip away whatever comfort the child might find in their presence. The abuse didn't stay confined to the home. Rica would be sent to school in inappropriate clothing, regardless of the weather. In the depths of Illinois winter, while other children arrived bundled up against the cold, Rica would appear without a coat. When concerned teachers at Fox Creek Elementary tried to help by providing her with warm clothing, Baker's reaction was telling. Instead of gratitude, she responded with rage, storming into the school to berate staff for showing kindness to Rica. Rica Rountree, Rica's father, wasn't just absent in protecting his daughter, he was complicit in her abuse. Text messages later recovered by investigators revealed conversations between him and Baker, discussing punishments for Rica with a casualness that chills the soul. These weren't heated moments of lost temper, they were calculated discussions about how to make a child suffer. The school environment, which should have been Rica's escape, became another source of anxiety. Teachers and staff noticed the changes in her behavior. The once outgoing, cheerful child became withdrawn. She flinched at sudden movements. She wore long sleeves even in warm weather, a classic sign of hiding bruises that too many chose to ignore. In December 2018, Rica missed 2 days of school. When she returned, she bore the unmistakable marks of violence, 2 black eyes, each in a different stage of healing. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a playground incident. This was a clear signal that something horrifically wrong was happening to this child. The school reported it, as they were legally obligated to do. Patricia Shannon, a child protection specialist with DCFS, was assigned to investigate. But like so many times before, the investigation would prove to be too little, too late. The system, designed to protect children like Rica, moved with a bureaucratic slowness that failed to match the urgency of her situation. What makes this even more tragic is that this wasn't the first time concerns had been raised. Months earlier, different teachers had reported suspicious bruises. Neighbors had called with concerns about shouting and crying coming from the house. Each report was investigated in isolation, each treated as a separate incident rather than part of a pattern of escalating abuse. During this time, Rica's mother, Anne, was serving her sentence, tormented by the knowledge that her daughter was suffering. Her warnings about Richard and Cynthia had fallen on deaf ears, dismissed as the bitter accusations of an incarcerated parent. The system that had taken Rica from her mother's care due to drug charges saw no issue with placing her in the care of a woman with a history of child abuse. Think about this. How many reports does it take before action is taken? How many bruises need to be documented? How many warning signs need to be raised before a child's cry for help is finally heard? These aren't just rhetorical questions. They're questions that haunt every case like Rica's, questions that demand answers from a system that too often fails the very children it's meant to protect. In January 2019, the temperature in Bloomington, Illinois dropped to bitter winter lows, but inside the Rountree home, Rica's nightmare was reaching its devastating climax. The abuse that had been escalating for months was about to reach a point of no return, though no one outside those walls knew just how little time Rica had left. The video evidence later discovered by investigators would reveal the true horror of what Rica endured in her final days. These weren't just moments of anger or loss of control. They were calculated acts of cruelty. Footage showed Cynthia Baker forcing Rica to hold stress positions for hours, striking her when she couldn't maintain them any longer. The camera caught Rica's desperate attempts to please her tormentor, to somehow survive another day in this house of horrors. But what makes this evidence even more disturbing is the question it raises. Why was someone recording this abuse? The answer would later emerge during the investigation. These videos were meant to be shared between Baker and Rica Rountree, Rica's father. They documented their abuse like proud accomplishments, exchanging messages about their disciplinary techniques as if discussing ordinary parenting matters. The text messages recovered from their phones paint a picture of calculated malice. "She's still standing," Baker would write, referring to Rica holding stress positions. "Not for long," Richard would reply. These weren't heat-of-the-moment exchanges. They were cold, premeditated discussions about torturing a child. On January 25, 2019, Rica arrived at the hospital. She wasn't walking, talking, or conscious. Her small body had finally given out under the weight of months of abuse. The medical staff who received her that day would later testify about the extent of her injuries. Rica's body told the story that she had never been able to tell in words. The autopsy report read like a catalogue of cruelty. Multiple internal injuries. Extensive bruising at various stages of healing. Several fractured ribs. The fatal blow had ruptured her intestine, causing a massive infection that her young body couldn't fight. But what struck the medical examiner most wasn't just the fatal injury. It was the evidence of long-term, systematic abuse that Rica's body revealed. The investigation that followed Rica's death would uncover layer upon layer of institutional failure. Every system designed to protect children like Rica had somehow fallen short. The Department of Children and Family Services had received multiple reports about Rica's situation. Teachers had documented their concerns. Neighbors had called about suspicious sounds. Yet somehow, Rica remained in that house, enduring abuse that would ultimately claim her life. The arrest of Cynthia Baker came swiftly, but the investigation revealed something even more disturbing. This wasn't her first encounter with child abuse allegations. Years before Rica entered her life, Baker had faced accusations of attempting to drown another child, her then stepchild. That case hadn't led to conviction, but the pattern was clear. The system had given a known abuser access to another vulnerable child. During Baker's trial, the prosecution presented evidence that would leave the courtroom in stunned silence. The videos of abuse. The text messages. The medical evidence. But perhaps most damning were the testimonies of other children in the household who had witnessed Rica's suffering. They spoke of how she was treated differently, how she was punished constantly, how they could hear her crying at night. The defense tried to paint Rica's injuries as accidents, as the result of normal childhood roughhousing. But the evidence told a different story. The systematic nature of the abuse, the documentation of it, the text messages, It all pointed to a level of premeditation that defied any innocent explanation. What emerged during the trial wasn't just the story of Rica's abuse, it was the story of how multiple systems had failed her. The child welfare system that placed her in that home despite Baker's history. The school system that reported concerns but couldn't force action. The legal system that had removed her from her mother's care only to place her in the hands of her abusers. Rica Rountree's role in his daughter's death became a central focus of the investigation. How could a father not only fail to protect his child but actively participate in her abuse? The text messages between him and Baker revealed a chilling dynamic, two adults encouraging each other's cruelty toward an innocent child. The trial also brought to light the psychological torture Rica had endured. Beyond the physical abuse, she had been systematically isolated, deprived of food, denied basic comfort, and stripped of any sense of security or belonging. Experts testified about the impact such treatment would have on a developing child, painting a picture of psychological trauma that paralleled the physical abuse. Former neighbors came forward with their stories. They spoke of hearing crying, of seeing Rica looking increasingly withdrawn, of feeling that something was wrong but not knowing how to help. Their testimonies added to the weight of evidence showing how many people had sensed something was wrong, yet somehow Rica had still slipped through the cracks. The investigation revealed another tragic detail. Rica had tried to tell people about her abuse. She had dropped hints to teachers, had shown signs that any trained professional should have recognized. But whether through fear, systemic inadequacy, or simple human failure, her silent calls for help went unanswered until it was too late. Think about this for a moment. In a world of mandatory reporting, surveillance cameras, and child protection services, how does a child suffer so visibly for so long without effective intervention? What needs to change in our systems, in our communities, in ourselves, to ensure we never fail another child like Rica? The trial of Cynthia Baker lasted 3 weeks, but for those in the courtroom, it felt like an eternity. Each day brought new revelations, new horrors, new reasons to question how this could have happened in their community. The prosecutors methodically built their case, piece by devastating piece, showing not just what happened to Rica, but how the system had failed her at every turn. The evidence presented in court went beyond the physical abuse. Financial records showed that while Baker spent lavishly on her own children, Rica was denied basic necessities. School records revealed a pattern of absences that coincided with visible injuries. The digital trail of text messages between Baker and Rica Rountree painted a picture of calculated cruelty that left even seasoned court officials shaken. The defense tried to portray Baker as a strict but caring stepmother, attempting to maintain discipline in a challenging household. But this narrative crumbled under the weight of evidence. Former babysitters testified about the stark differences in how Rica was treated compared to other children in the home. They spoke of seeing her isolated during meals, forced to stand for hours, and subjected to arbitrary punishments that went far beyond any reasonable definition of discipline. Medical experts took the stand, explaining in clinical detail how Rica's final injury occurred. The rupture to her intestine wasn't from a fall or accident as the defense claimed. It was from a forceful blow, delivered with enough power to cause fatal internal damage. But even more damning was their testimony about her other injuries, the ones that had healed and re-healed, showing months of sustained abuse. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the testimony of child psychology experts who explained the impact of prolonged abuse on a child's behavior. They helped the jury understand why Rica might not have spoken out more clearly about her abuse, why she might have tried to please her abusers, why she might have blamed herself for the treatment she received. Their testimony helped dispel the common misconception that victims of abuse simply need to tell someone to be saved. At this point in our story, I want to take a moment to speak directly to our viewers. What we're discussing here isn't just another true crime case, it's a wake-up call for our society. If you're as moved by Rica's story as we are, if you want to be part of the change that ensures no other child suffers this fate, please consider subscribing to True Crime Watch HD. Together, we can keep these important conversations going and work toward real change in our communities. The trial also brought to light the systemic failures that had allowed Rica's abuse to continue. DCFS workers took the stand, trying to explain their actions, or lack thereof, in the months leading up to Rica's death. Their testimony revealed a system overwhelmed by cases, understaffed and underfunded, where workers carried caseloads far beyond recommended limits. But these explanations felt hollow in the face of Rica's suffering. Police investigators shared their findings from the crime scene. They described entering the house where Rica had spent her final months, finding the bare mattress where she slept, the heavy cans she had been forced to hold, the corner where she had been made to stand for hours. They found her broken dolls, the ones Baker had destroyed to break her spirit, stuffed in a garbage bag in the garage. The jury also heard from Rica's teachers, who spoke through tears about the changes they had observed in her. They described a bright, engaging child who had gradually become withdrawn and fearful. They talked about the reports they had filed, the concerns they had raised, the frustration they felt at the lack of action. Their testimony underscored a crucial point. The system doesn't just fail children, it fails the people trying to protect them. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Rica's mother, Anne. Speaking from prison, she described her desperate attempts to warn authorities about the danger her daughter faced. She shared letters Rica had written to her, letters that took on new meaning in light of what was now known. The courtroom fell silent as she read Rica's words, "Mommy, I miss you. I want to come home." Digital forensics experts testified about the videos and text messages recovered from Baker's and Rountree's phones. They showed how the abuse had been documented, shared, even discussed as if it were normal parenting. The jury saw messages where Baker and Rountree planned punishments, mocked Rica's suffering, and encouraged each other's cruelty. The impact of these revelations extended beyond the courtroom. Child welfare advocates began calling for systemic changes. Questions were raised about how background checks are conducted, how abuse reports are investigated, how decisions about child placement are made. Rica's case became a rallying cry for reform in the child protection system. Community members who had known Rica, who had seen her in the neighborhood or at school, grappled with their own role in her story. Many wondered if they could have done more, said more, pushed harder for intervention. Her case sparked difficult but necessary conversations about community responsibility and the obligation to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. The prosecution's closing arguments were powerful in their simplicity. They reminded the jury that Rica was not just a victim in a case. She was a child who had loved dolls, who had dreamed of being a teacher, who had tried so hard to survive in a world that had failed to protect her. They asked the jury to do what no one else had done for Rica, to see her pain and act on it. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as Cynthia Baker was found guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of aggravated battery of a child, guilty of all charges relating to the abuse and death of Rica Rountree. The verdict brought tears to the eyes of many in the courtroom, but they weren't tears of joy. They were tears for a justice that came too late to save an 8-year-old girl. In January 2020, almost exactly 1 year after Rica's death, Baker was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words during sentencing echoed through the courtroom. This court cannot imagine a more horrible crime than the systematic abuse and murder of an innocent child. But even this sentence, the harshest possible under law, felt inadequate in the face of what Rica had endured. Richard Rountree's case followed. The man who had been Rica's father in name only, who had not just failed to protect his daughter but had actively participated in her abuse, faced his own day in court. His text messages, his complicity, his failure to act when his child needed him most, all of it came back to haunt him. He too would face justice, but like Baker's conviction, it felt hollow in the shadow of Rica's absence. The aftermath of Rica's case rippled through Illinois' child welfare system. The Department of Children and Family Services faced intense scrutiny over their handling of Rica's case. Internal reviews were ordered, policies were questioned, and promises of reform were made. But for many, these changes felt like too little, too late, another reaction to tragedy rather than the prevention they had hoped for. And Simmons, Rica's mother, spoke out from prison about the devastating impact of losing her daughter. "I knew something was wrong," she said in interviews. I tried to tell them, but nobody listened. Her words became a rallying cry for reform advocates who pointed to Rica's case as an example of how the system often dismisses the concerns of parents, especially those who have had their own struggles with the law. The community of Bloomington, Illinois, struggled to come to terms with what had happened in their midst. Rica's school, Fox Creek Elementary, established a memorial garden in her honor. Teachers who had tried to help her planted flowers, the bright, cheerful kinds that Rica had loved. It became a place of reflection, a reminder of both the preciousness of childhood and the responsibility we all share in protecting it. But Rica's story didn't end with the verdicts or the memorials. It sparked a larger conversation about child protection in America. Advocates pointed to several critical issues that Rica's case had highlighted: the need for better background checks for caregivers, the importance of taking multiple abuse reports as a pattern rather than isolated incidents, and the critical need for better communication between schools, social services, and law enforcement. The case also led to proposed legislation in Illinois. Rica's law aimed to strengthen the state's child protection system by requiring more thorough background checks for adults living in homes where children are placed, mandating faster response times to abuse allegations, and providing better training for caseworkers to recognize patterns of systematic abuse. Mental health professionals who reviewed Rica's case pointed out the sophisticated nature of the abuse she endured. The combination of physical violence, psychological torture, and social isolation represented a particularly insidious form of child abuse, one that exploited the vulnerabilities of both the victim and the system meant to protect them. Rica's teachers, who had tried to help her, became vocal advocates for change in how schools handle suspected abuse cases. They spoke at conferences, sharing their experiences and the warning signs they had noticed, helping other educators learn to better recognize and respond to signs of abuse. Their message was clear: one report isn't enough, persistence and documentation are crucial. The digital evidence in Rica's case, the videos and text messages, sparked discussions about technology's role in both perpetrating and preventing abuse. While her abusers had used phones to document and share their cruelty, these same devices ultimately provided crucial evidence. This led to conversations about how technology might be better utilized to protect vulnerable children. In the years following Rica's death, her story has become a case study in child protection training programs. Social workers, teachers, and law enforcement officers learn from the mistakes made, the signs missed, and the opportunities for intervention that slipped away. Her case teaches them to look deeper, act faster, and never assume someone else will take responsibility for protecting a child in danger. But perhaps the most important legacy of Rica's case is the way it changed how we think about child abuse reporting. The old assumption that one report is enough, that once authorities are notified our responsibility ends, has been challenged. Rica's story teaches us that protection requires persistence, that saving a child sometimes means being the voice that won't be silenced. Today, Rica's memorial garden continues to bloom. Each flower serves as a reminder of a life cut tragically short, but also as a symbol of hope. Hope that her story will save others, that her death will continue to drive change, that somewhere another child in danger will be saved because someone remembered Rica and chose to act. As we conclude Rica's story, remember that while we can't change her past, we can honor her memory by working to protect other children. Her story reminds us that the responsibility for protecting children belongs to all of us, teachers, neighbors, family members, and strangers alike. The signs of abuse are often there, waiting to be seen, waiting for someone to take action. Rica Rountree was more than a victim. She was a little girl who loved dolls, who dreamed of being a teacher, who deserved so much more than the world gave her. May her story continue to drive change, save lives, and remind us all that when it comes to protecting children, silence is never an option.